So today we have Melanie Leonard of Streamlined Legal with us, and Streamlined Legal is our Q2 Guild Mastermind sponsor. So we want to thank you guys for that as well. And today she's going to present breaking through the bottlenecks, overcoming the top pain points in legal workflows. So welcome, Melanie, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Becca. I appreciate that. Thank you for that kind welcome. It's our pleasure and our honor to be sponsors this quarter. Being a practicing attorney myself, I definitely can relate to the things that you guys are going through and found this group very helpful when I was practicing. And now being able to offer something back to this group is just a pleasure for us. So thank you for having us. As Becca described, we are talking today about basically breaking through the bottleneck, right? And when we talk about that, I'm specifically referring to getting stuff done in the office, right? Now, for those of you that joined us at the Guild back in last month in Austin, great time. If you haven't been to one of those meetings, please do join. Please do join the team down there. It has been a fantastic group. And for me to be able to present to you guys about workflows in particular is what we talked about at that meeting. And it was a great opportunity to talk a little bit about how stuff gets done in our office, right? So I'm talking about not just sales, not just marketing, not just the administrative stuff, but actually representing our clients, whether it's a transactional practice or litigation practice or whatever you've got. Being able to get that work done in the office is so helpful. And being able to make sure that it's done well and consistently and being able to present that to our clients is awesome. So I want to make sure you're able to continue doing that. So we're going to talk today a little bit about those bottlenecks and how we can break through them. And I'm going to go ahead and share a couple of slides here with you. Excellent. So again, for those of you I haven't met, my name is Melanie. I'm from Streamlined Legal. I was a practicing attorney for a number of years before starting Streamlined Legal and selling my law firm. And that's where I really got to know practice management software. I got to know practice management of a law firm and how to handle a law firm, a lot of it by trial and error, and then a lot of it from resources like this Facebook group. So I'm excited to be here today to talk with you guys. If you are at the Austin presentation, you might recognize this slide. We talked a lot about creating workflows in our office, right? And a workflow is just simply who does what by when, right? So if we look at this slide, you can see that I've gone through here and just started listing out my steps that I take in intake in particular, right? This is an intake example. So I'm going to send a questionnaire to the potential client, right? Then we're going to follow up with the potential client to make sure that they fill out the questionnaire. And you'll see all the steps. I made them really super basic, right? Like this is just what we do when we work with a new potential client. Then in the second column, I listed out who we worked with, or sorry, who's doing the task, right? We've got the receptionist first, we've got the client relations specialist, we've got the administrative assistant, everyone's got their part to play, right? Now, you may not have all these people in your team yet, and that's okay. Some of you may be wearing multiple hats in your team, and that's okay too. But we do want to break these out by the position, right? By the role, so that as we have more people coming in, it's very easy to assign what we need them to do, right? And then the last column here is the when they're going to do these things, right? And we're going to, of course, it really doesn't matter how you spell this out. I've used some technical terms here, but it really is just, when are we going to do this? First, we're going to send the questionnaire. 2 days later, we're going to follow up. 3 days later, we're going to enter all that data into our practice management software. So it really just, you can spell it out however you want, but let's just get a time frame for when these things are happening, right? And that's the most important part, right? These are the things that are going to help us break through those log jams, right? Make sure that things keep happening. Make sure that I'm not the reason things aren't happening. What I see a lot in law firms, and you can tell me if this is something that you've experienced in your firm, is I see that people will know, the first 2 or 3 steps, and then they're not sure, or they're not confident, or they don't know if they are guessing the right thing the attorney wants them to do. And so they go and they ask the attorney. But the more that this happens, of course, the attorney's sitting there trying to get stuff done and is constantly answering questions all day, right? Or things get delayed because they haven't given direction in a while, right? And so I don't want you to be the logjam, and I want to make sure that we're making these processes as smooth and easy as possible. So that's one of the reasons that we write out these workflows. So we're going to cover two main topics today. The first one is why the benefits of having workflows, right? And then the second one is how we're going to design and create those workflows so that you can break through those bottlenecks, right? Let's make sure that we're not creating any bottlenecks in these workflows and that we can make things move along very, very smoothly. So first off, why do we need these workflows? I know if you were in Austin, we talked a little bit about some of these reasons, but I know that some of you are still not convinced. So I'm here to convince you, right? Whether you put it in a software or whether you put it in a Word document or whether you write it out on a whiteboard, doesn't really matter, right? The important part is that we have the steps that we're talking about, right? We have the who does what by when, because that's what's going to set us up for success as a team, right? Now, again, if you were a solo or if you are a solo, you are doing these steps already. It's just that they're probably all stuck in your head, right? And even if you're not a solo, you might have some of these steps stuck in your head. The problem is the rest of the team doesn't know what's going on in that head all the time. We like to think that they do, but they don't always. And so instead, we want to pull that stuff out of our brains and write it down in these workflows like we're talking about. So let's talk about some of these benefits. By the way, before I dive into those, you are more than welcome to add any questions that you have into the chat. I know that Becca is monitoring that and will let us know if we get any questions. I'm happy to pause. I'm happy to take those questions. I'm happy to get them at the end as well. So please feel free to drop them in the chat if I pique your interest, or if I don't cover something that you wish I would cover, I'd be happy to take those questions at any time. So, first off, why do we need workflows? Why is this even a thing? Why is she so passionate about them? Because I really am passionate about them. Number one is, as a managing attorney, as a supervisor of any type, it is really exhausting for me to have to go around and just ask everybody what's going on, right? What's going on with this case? What happened in this case? Did you do this? Did you do that? Like, these are questions that I don't want to ask. I just want to have the information, right? And the nice part about it is that I also don't want my team to have to write down every single little thing they do, right? So if instead we have these pre-built templates of some kind for these workflows, where we can just drop a workflow on the case, right? Whether it's a checklist in a paper file or a task list in your Clio or a workflow in your My Case or whatever you've got, right? If we can just put that template in there, now the team doesn't have to write it down. They see what they need to do. They check it off. I can go by at any time and see the current status of things, right? It really lets me know the status at all times of all matters. And that is very, very helpful. So in addition to that, we've got faster and easier training, right? I really want to make sure that when a new team member comes in, or maybe a team member that's not quite up to speed on some additional new job responsibilities and things like that, it makes it so much easier for them to have these workflows that they can pick out what parts of the workflow they're supposed to be doing and when they're supposed to be doing it, right? So they don't have to ask 100 times before they figure it out. They don't have to ask 5 times before they figure it out. It's always there in this workflow as to what step they're supposed to be doing next or who's supposed to be doing the next step. So it really keeps our team up to speed and able to train and make decisions faster. It also sets clear expectations, right? If there's something that's important to me and I want to make sure that this part gets done or this gets done this way, I can put that in the workflow. And when they see that, now it's a reminder to them every time they're triggered to do that task that this is how it needs to be done and this is what we're expecting, right? It cuts back on so much miscommunication, right? We hire people, a lot of times they've worked in other firms, they've done similar jobs. We think they know what we want, and that's not always true, right? They may have done it differently in their old job. They may not have the same expectation that I do. And if I'm not consistently spelling that out for them, then sometimes we forget, sometimes we don't understand. It just makes that communication that much smoother, right? It also allows us to create a contingency plan, right? If this is the workflow that I follow for 90% of my cases, 99% of my cases, whatever, then that's awesome. But on those occasions where I have a plan, or sorry, I have a case that doesn't go as planned, now I can take my workflow and I can adjust it, right? It's much easier. I know you guys have learned this from drafting, right? It's much easier to start from a template and move things around and change things and add detail and adjust them than it is to start from scratch. And so I would propose to you that unless you're working from a workflow or a checklist or some other resource like that, that every time you get a new case, you're starting from scratch, right? The stuff is in your head, but we still have to pull it out every single time. And if instead we pull it out once and do a workflow and use that same workflow all throughout the case, then that's going to be a lot more helpful. We also, it helps us create more effective process change, right? If I have these steps and I say every time we file something with the court, we're going to send a copy to the client, right? And we've been emailing them and emailing them, emailing them. And eventually we get to a point where we decide, you know what, this is going to be a lot easier if we just put it in a client portal, make a nice video, do an orientation with our clients, teach them how to use the portal. That kind of stuff will work a lot better than this constant email because they're losing our emails. They're getting overwhelmed by emails. It's not helping, right? Let's say we want to make that change in our internal procedures. If we document that in our new workflow, right, revise our workflow to say that, that's going to remind the person every time that, hey, we have a new process. This is how we do it, right? As opposed to me having to go around and tell everybody or have a meeting where we talk about it and then everybody walks out of the meeting and sometimes they forget, right? Hopefully this will, or I shouldn't say hopefully, this definitely will keep it more top of mind for them. And every time they're triggered to do this task in this workflow, it will be in there that we've made this process change and it will take more effect more quickly. It will help us improve and stay relevant, right? Again, if we aren't making those kinds of changes like client portals or, online payments or things like that, we will get left in the dust, right? We will find clients that are no longer willing to work with us because it's making their life harder to not have these conveniences. If we're not as easy to use as other products or services, if it's easier to get into the doctor and get my healthcare taken care of than it is to get into the law firm to have my legal advice given, that's going to be a challenge, right? I'm not going to want to do it. And then on our page here, we've got prevent decision fatigue, right? The nice thing about a workflow is it gives us a default. This is the default way that we're going to handle things unless being told otherwise, right? Or unless we make another decision. So there's always a default as to how to act. I don't have to decide with every case, how are we going to do things? I have general rules. We follow those unless I find something in the case that makes me change that, right? So I don't have to make as many decisions throughout the day because now everything's got a default. So the only decisions I'm making are those that I've identified are different than the norm, right? Now, that's not the only benefit. We also are creating such a valuable asset. I know there's a lot of discussion in the Maximum Lawyer Facebook group about, maybe positioning our firms for sale at some point. What are we going to name our firms so that when we're not there, we can sell it? There's a lot of thought about that, which I think is awesome, right? Because this is a huge asset for us. But I will tell you, having a law firm with these built out workflows is so much a more valuable asset than without, because now it basically can become a plug and play law firm, right? I can take people that know the basics of paralegal work or legal assistants or attorneys, and I can now give them some very definite structure and ways to operate, right? So having these workflows that are essentially your procedures, right, as to how we do things, is going to be such a stronger asset and more valuable asset than without. So definitely these are things that will increase the value of your firm in a possible resale situation. It will also create more productive meetings. Again, if we don't have to spend our whole meeting trying to figure out what needs to be done next on a case, then we've got a lot more time to talk about the more substantive issues, right? Or the more customer service oriented issues, right? Sometimes we get into a situation where we are doing a review meeting or something like that, and these meetings can just go on. I mean, like I've been in them, right? Sometimes we dread even having them because we know how long they're going to be, right? But the idea is that if we've got our workflows and our statuses where we left off on everything in our workflows in our case management software or wherever we're keeping them, it's so easy just to go, look, confirm that everything's good and move on, right? Or look at the steps ahead, make sure that they still fit, and then move on. It makes for a much better service that we're providing to our clients too, because now we're able to review those files more often because it's not taking all day, right? We also can facilitate communication in a remote workplace. We at Streamlined Legal run a remote workplace. We do not have a physical location that we all meet at. And so instead, we're able to communicate very well through our task lists in Clio. We use Clio for our workflows, but wherever you're housing yours, if everyone can access it and know what everybody else has on their plate and what they're working on and what they intend to work on, that makes for so much less internal communication, right? If you're feeling like your inbox is overwhelmed by internal emails, this is an answer for you, right? I worked with a firm yesterday who had a similar situation. They were getting emails all the time internally. They would get memos to the file emails. They would get 30-day check-ins with their client emails, 60 days, 90 days. Like the internal emails were out of control. And so when we were able to put those into a workflow and into their practice management software, as opposed to the excessive, what I would call excessive emails, it made a world of difference. Okay, then our last couple that we've pointed out here is creating consistency for automation. For those of you that tried to automate, we talk about that in the Facebook group a lot too, right? How can I use Zapier? How can I use these different tools to automate things? I love automation. What I don't love, and no one loves, is automation gone wild, right? If you're not putting the right data into the software or the right things aren't happening to trigger your automation consistently, it's not going to work, right? So instead, if we have these workflows that spell out very clearly what steps we're going to take when things happen, that's going to make for much more consistent processes that are going to allow for a lot more automation, right? If I can say every time this happens, we want this to happen, then I can go ahead and automate that. But if I'm just flying by the seat of my pants and I'm just trying to figure things out every time with every case, it's going to be really, really hard to automate that. And then lastly, for today, we have decrease the risk of malpractice. Again, if I have these default instructions as to how I want the case to run or how I want this part of the case to run, then it's much easier for me to make sure everyone is following along with that than to have to reinvent the wheel every time. And if it's documented for my team to know what they're supposed to be doing, then that's going to decrease the risk of malpractice, right? Because now we have something to point to, we have something to guide us, we have something to mold into the case that we want it to be. So if you weren't convinced by now, don't worry about it. Just forget the workflows. Like, it's not worth it. If none of those reasons are compelling for you, then don't worry about it. Go focus on other things, focus on marketing or whatever. But if there was anything in those two lists that were compelling to you, then stick around, because next we're going to talk about how we're going to prevent bottlenecks, right? And how our workflows are going to help us to do that, right? By the way, I do have one more thing to show you for those of you that are more visual and love numbers, right? So here's our workflow sheet again that we looked at a few minutes ago, but I've added a couple of columns here, right? I've added the time, I've added the rate, and I've added the cost. Okay, so essentially what I did was I took our same list of the same tasks that we were doing earlier, same people are doing them, same time frame, but now I'm going to look at how long do I think that's going to take someone to do it? And so I've put some times here, 0.2 hours, 0.1 hours, good old 6-minute increments of time tracking. And then I went by and I said, okay, well, how much do I pay that person, right? Because that's how much, not all of what it costs me, but that's a majority of what it's costing me to provide that service. So if my firm is going to send out a questionnaire and it takes my receptionist 0.2 hours to do it, at a rate of $10 an hour, totally making these numbers up, then obviously that's going to cost me $2 to send out that questionnaire, right? And if I can go through my whole process of representing a client this way, I can add all these numbers up and figure out how much it costs me to provide a service. So the next time a client comes to you and says, how much is this estate plan going to cost me? If you have a flat fee, you are set, right? But if they come back and say, how much is this divorce going to cost me? And you're doing that on an hourly basis. I have attorneys all the time tell me, I don't know. It could be a short divorce. It could be a long divorce. Of course, they're all different. But I promise you, you are in a much better position to give that type of estimate to your client than your client is, right? They've never done a divorce. They don't know anything about divorce except what you've told them. So being able to spell out, hey, just keep in mind, client, if we do this expert witness, it's probably going to cost somewhere around this range. And I know that because I know all the steps that we're going to do when we do a deposition of an expert. And I know all of how much it's going to cost me to provide that service to my client, right? It's an estimate, it's a range, but you're going to be much closer than your client's going to be in their world of, I have no idea, right? So the workflow is going to help you do this. And that's another great reason to do workflows. Okay. So let's get through these bottlenecks, because here's the truth. Even when you have workflows, sometimes bottlenecks are created, right? So we want to make sure we're putting together our workflows in a way that's going to prevent that. And I know you've all experienced it. It happens in all firms one time or another, right? So let's talk about these bottlenecks, and let's talk about how we're going to get through them, right? The first thing is, I have attorneys that will talk to me about, my client never gets back to me. They never send the stuff. I can't do the estate plan because I don't have all the documents. They never fill out the questionnaire, all of these things that the clients aren't doing, right? And that is frustrating. And there's all kinds of tools and ways that we can try and make that better. But the A1 thing that I don't see a lot of attorneys doing, or I should say law firms doing, is we're not consistently following up for these things with our client, right? So the first thing I have is, when you're creating your workflows, I want to make sure that you're making a follow-up for every time that you send out a document for review or signature, or anytime you request a document or information. This could be, by the way, from your client, or it could be from opposing counsel, right? Anytime you make a request, I want to make sure that we have a step in our workflow that says follow up, right? And when we do find that step and we follow up, I want there to be another step that says follow up again if we didn't get it, right? And this is a trend, right? Because here's what happens. The more we can set expectations with our clients and say, hey, here's your form. You have 5 days. We need it back within there, and within the 5 days in order to meet our deadlines and so forth. Then I follow up in 5 days. Now they know that I'm serious, right? This isn't just a, hey, when you get around to it, right? 5 days comes, I call them up. Hey, I'm so sorry, I didn't get it done. Give me a couple more days. Okay, great. I'll follow up with you on Tuesday. So then we call again on Tuesday. Oh, okay. And the more that we're following up and being persistent, the more likely it is that they're going to comply with that, right? So again, there are other tools and other ways that we can do it that will also be successful, but this is like a super basic step that I see a lot of attorneys or their team not always doing, right? So when you make your workflows, make sure that you're putting up follow-up tasks anytime that you send out anything or need anything back, right? Because that's what's going to help us stay on track and make sure that things get done, okay? Then the next thing I want you to do is, once you've listed out all the things you need to do in your workflow, I want you to take a look at each individual step. And if that step is going to take longer than 15 minutes, then I want to make sure there's an instruction there for you to go ahead and put a time block on your calendar to do that step. Okay. Because here's what's also happens. I see this a lot. We get these workflows, we get a list of things that need to happen each day, things we need to do. And unfortunately, we run out of time, right? We have 50 things on our list, and there's no way we can do 50 things on a list in one day. And so we run out of time. Whereas instead, if we have those larger tasks and we go to the calendar and we block out a time to complete them, that's going to make it much more likely that we get them done, right? Especially with these bigger projects, right? If we're talking about drafting or, things that take a while, we want to put those on the calendar. Now, here's a bonus point that I didn't put down on the slide, but if you have a particularly large time block and it's super important, like maybe we're prepping for trial or prepping for a deposition, when that trial or deposition gets scheduled, you're going to have to prep for it. So why don't you put the time block on your calendar the minute it gets scheduled, right? Because that will allow you to then save that space and make sure that you have that time to do that project or do that preparation. So do think about not only time blocking for these larger tasks, but putting it on the calendar as early as possible. You can always move it. We can always adjust things. But if we're not saving time for it, that's what creates these last minute, I was up all night prepping for trial. Could you have prepped the day before, 2 days before, the week before? Probably, right? If we had only saved the time, right? But what happens is if we don't save that time, we let other things take priority and we don't get to that trial prep until the last minute. Now we're exhausted. Now we're showing up in court for a deposition or a trial or whatever it is, exhausted and not doing our best as far as representing our clients. And so I would highly recommend that you go ahead and keep that in mind. Now, the next thing I want to make sure that we're preventing these bottlenecks is put the procedure in the workflow, right? So what happens sometimes is our assistant, our paralegal, our associate, they're just not sure or confident as to what we want to happen next. Maybe we didn't communicate it in time. Maybe we didn't communicate it well. Maybe they didn't ask the question. There's all kinds of reasons why this can happen, right? But if we have the procedure in the workflow and it already says, this is how we do it and this is what we want you to do, then there's no question, right? They just go ahead and do it at the appropriate time. Now, of course, for that to work really well, we as the supervising attorney or the supervisor, we need to make sure that we're monitoring those tasks with some regularity. I'll check in on the, on the workflow once a week, once a month, whatever's appropriate for the cadence of your representation. And I need to go in there and make sure that it's actually spelled out the way I want it, right? So when we first get the case, I'm going to look at the workflow, make sure it matches up with what we want. Again, if we're building them to apply to 80, 90% of the scenarios, then we're in good shape. But occasionally I'll have to move some stuff around. So as long as I'm doing that review with some regularity, then they're going to be on track all the time, right? There's less questions, there's less anything. The procedure is in the workflow. They know how to do it because the steps are written in there. And then we're also going to update our workflow in each case and update our tasks, right? So just like I was talking about before, when I get the new case in and I see the plan is to do the same 30 things we always do to file a complaint, that's awesome. But in this case, I actually want to file it like the day before the statute of limitations. There's a reason for that, strategic reason. And so I'm going to shift everything and move it out, right? Or the opposite, right? Usually we take about 30 days to file a complaint, but this particular case needs to happen in like 2 weeks. So I'm going to shift all of the workflow and make sure that it happens within those 2 weeks, right? But if I'm not doing that supervising or not overlook, then it's just going to take that same 30-day time frame and my client's going to get frustrated, right? Or we'll miss a deadline or something like that. So I want to make sure that whenever I use these workflows, they're being reviewed so that they can be adjusted for that particular case, or the tasks within them can be adjusted for that particular case. Now, that's not the only place it can go wrong, right? We want to make sure that when we build these workflows, that we're paying a particular attention to timing, right? We want to make sure that the timing is helpful and that we're building these workflows either forward or backward. And what I mean by that is if I'm initiating something like I'm filing a complaint or a petition or I'm starting an action, then I want to make sure that I'm working as quickly as possible, right? But there's not always a deadline. Sometimes there's a statute of limitations, but not always. And so I want to make sure that once the complaint is drafted, it gets reviewed pretty quickly, it gets filed quickly, it gets processed quickly. Everything happens as quickly as we're able to do it, right? And very proactively, by the way. So I'm going to build these task lists to say, first this happens, then that happens, then that happens, and so on down the line. Now, there are other times when maybe I'm responding to something. So maybe I'm filing the answer, or maybe I'm, preparing for some other type of deadline, a trial, let's say. Then I'm going to want to build my workflows backwards, right? So I'm going to want to say, well, when's the deadline? When's the trial? And then I'm going to say, okay, well, a week before trial, I want to make sure we've done these things. And 2 weeks before trial, I want to make sure we do these things. And 3 weeks before trial. So now I'm building my workflow backwards based on that deadline, right? So either one can be helpful. It just depends on the scenario, right? Now, if you want to get super advanced, it can also be very helpful to work from both directions in your workflows. So for example, if I'm representing a client in a real estate transaction, right? As soon as I get that contract or I meet the client or I get hired, there's a bunch of stuff I want to do to make sure I'm prepared, right? So I'm going to start day 1, get the contract. Day 2, review it. Day 3, talk to the client about it. Day 4, write my attorney review letter or whatever the process is in your jurisdiction. So I'm going to do those things starting from the beginning, working forward. But I also know that I have a closing to get ready for, and the closing is on day 30. And so there are other things that I may want to do based on that closing. So a week before the closing, I want to make sure this happens. 2 weeks before the closing, I want to make sure this happens. So in my workflow, I may simultaneously be basing my timeframes on going forward from the contract or going backward from the deadline, right? Or the trial or the closing or whatever it is. So you can do both in the same workflow. You just need to remain cognizant of which tasks are dependent on going forward or going backwards. But that's where the real power, one of the real powers in workflows comes from, is making sure that that time frame is as accurate as possible, because that's what's going to help you be able to set these things a little bit on automatic pilot. Again, you are going to be reviewing, you are going to be adjusting, but it doesn't require your hour-to-hour attention, right? Because now your team has their marching orders and has their the plan, and they all know how to tackle the plan accordingly. Last 2 things here. We want to make sure that we're not creating these task lists that are overwhelming to us, or these workflows that are overwhelming to us, right? If I think about especially litigation files, those can go on and they can take 100 different turns, right? So I'm probably not going to be able to come up with a plan for the whole case all at once, right? I don't know if we're going to settle. I don't know if we're not going to settle. I don't know if I'm doing discovery yet, or what kind of discovery, or do I need experts? I don't even know that stuff yet, right? So at the beginning, I'm just going to have a workflow for the complaint, or I'm just going to have a workflow for the answer. Once we get through that, then we determine if we need to do discovery, right? And then I'll use my discovery workflow, or maybe we don't, and then I won't. Or maybe we have an expert that we need, and I'll use my expert workflow, or maybe we don't. So being able to break your workflow into smaller parts can be very helpful, because then even if it's a small little 3-step workflow, I can use it when I need it, but it's flexible enough that I can leave it out if I don't need it, right? So don't be afraid to tackle your big workflows by creating smaller little workflows that either follow one after the other, or only get applied if they're needed. And then lastly for today, we're going to talk about these trigger dates, right? We want to make sure that we're starting these workflows at an appropriate time, right? Now, 90%, 80% of the time, we're going to start a workflow when the work needs to be done, right? So for example, I'm doing discovery and I know we've already filed our answer. Now it's time to start some discovery. I'm going to go ahead and start that, right? But there may be other times that for tactical or strategical reasons, I don't want to start that discovery yet, but I also don't want to forget about it, right? So instead, I can, in most of the software out today, I can set my workflow for the future, for a future date. So I can say, you know what, I know in 60 days, I'm going to want to start discovery, but I don't want to start it now and I don't want to forget. So I'm going to go ahead and tell the software to start my workflow in 60 days, right? When you get to a point where you can put these workflows into your practice management software or your project management work software or whatever you have, a lot of them will have that type of feature, which is super handy because now I don't have to remember that for 60 days, right? And it's going to remind me. A lot of times when we look at practice management, and we look at how we run our law firms, we are not always being very judicious with when and how we share information. And this is, you see this in email all the time. Someone will send you an email about something. Well, it's something that I don't need to know right now, frankly. I don't need to know it till Tuesday when I have a call with my client. But if you give it to me now, it's like you took it off of your plate and you put it on my plate, but now my plate's overflowing instead of yours, right? And that's not very helpful, right? I mean, I know, yes, good to get it off your plate, but it really would be best if we can come up with a different way to do things. And so these workflows really do help with that, right? Because they allow me to not have to focus or think about things until the time, at such time as it becomes important, right? Until such time as I'm trying to help my client with that. So use these tips when you're thinking through your workflows so that you can help avoid bottlenecks in your firm. I want to make sure that we're as productive as possible, successful as possible. I will tell you from having worked in a law firm that both had these workflows and then one that did not, it is much more relaxing, much more an enjoyable experience, much better camaraderie, culture, all kinds of things. And we're able to provide our clients a much better service by having these workflows, because it just cuts back on so much of the little nitty-gritty details that don't, that can be distracting on a day-to-day basis, right? So if you have any questions about workflows, I'd love to talk about them. Here's how you can get a hold of us in case you're not ready to ask your question, but you're welcome to reach out. We work with workflows all of the time in the form of Clio task lists that we help our clients develop. And then we also work with them in the form of Lawmatics workflows and Clio Grow workflows. So if you are working with any of those three softwares and would like some help with your workflows or putting your workflows into the software, please feel free to give us a call.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie.
My pleasure.
Yes. I do not see any questions in the group right now, but I did want to add that if you're watching this on the replay, Melanie is in the group. So if you'll just tag her and add your question in the comments, I know that she'll get back to you.
That is true. I am a fan of Facebook and most things social media, as you can see by our tags here. So please feel free, if you're watching the replay, feel free to reach out to us on any of those platforms.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank you.